everyone. Welcome to Science Friday.
Here are some for E as well. The one on the top here is one of the ways that you can define E.
What makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution?
So this can be, like, in the case of this paper, gyrification or brain folds.
A neuroscientist started to look at the brain
as like the
more as an
interconnected
I'm
are very
incredibly negative.
Not what I described.
Is the mic on? All right. So, hello and welcome everyone to Science Friday. I'm going to be presenting about the impact of invasive species on the similarity between the world's biogeographical regions overall. So, the reason why I'm interested in biodiversity is it started all on a trip about 5 or 6 years ago to Ukraine to visit my grandparents. My grandfather and I visited this forest, and when I visited this forest, I noticed that there weren't any animals. When I asked my grandfather about this, he said, when I was younger, this forest used to be filled with animals, but ever since pesticides had been implemented in agriculture during the Soviet Union, there was a remarkable decrease in the animal diversity in the region. Just seeing, like, even 30 years after the pesticides had been after the end of the usage of pesticides, I could see the impact of this. For several hours while I walked in this forest, I didn't see a single animal. There were plenty of trees. It was beautiful, but there was something to me fundamentally haunting about seeing a region that was so devastated by humans in the name of increasing agricultural output. And the way this relates to my paper is my paper talks about the impact of invasive species spread by humans on the similarities of the world's biogeographical regions. So just to explain this a bit better, when invasive species go from one region to the next, that process is called naturalization. And that leads to a greater level of similarity between the types of species present in both regions. And that overall just causes a global increase in the homogenization of the world's flora. So just to illustrate this a little bit more graphically, here's a graphical representation from the paper. Essentially, what you can see here is that there are two regions. Let's call this gray area region 1, this other gray region, region 2. And as you can see, there are certain species here, or the shapes represent distinct species that are present in both regions. So you can see that there is movement between this species over to this region and this species over to this region. This essentially conveys how invasive species move from one region to another. And because now there's an extra pair of regions that are common to the region, there's an increase in the similarity between the two regions. And the way that the paper quantified this is that it took data about invasive species and native species of 658 of the world's regions, and they found the similarities between the numbers of species in each. And one of the main relationships that they demonstrated is this relationship between the geographic distance of the two regions and the similarity between the two. So here you can see on this x-axis scale, the geographic distance between the two regions increases from 0 to 20,000 kilometers. And on the y-axis here, you can see a taxonomic similarity increasing. And another thing that is worth noting here is that this figure shows how the researchers compared both just the native species for similarity and how they showed the similarities between the native and invasive species in each region. And one of the main takeaways of this study is if you look at a geographic distance of 5,000 kilometers, for example, you see that the curve fit line for the comparison between the native and the naturalized species is overall higher than the native, and just a comparison between the native species. This makes logical sense because native species are different in different geographical regions. And to move into the bulk of the scientific paper, the main relationship that the presentation showed was overall as the geographic distance between two regions increases, along this x-axis, the amount of similarity between the two regions increases. So for all of these lines of best fit here, it shows that generally as the geographic distance increases, there is an overall increase in the degree of homogenization between the two regions. And another key relationship that this figure conveys from the paper is that there's a relationship between the similarities of the climates and the degree of similarity between the two regions. So here, the distance between the climates is represented by different colors, going from the most similar here, a kind of black dark color, to this pink light one, which represents a large disparity between the climates of the two regions. And if you, for example, look at this set of solid lines, you can see that the line at about 10,000 shows that the climates with similar regions have a higher degree of similarity than those with lower degrees with lower degrees of similarity between the climates of the two regions. And the final thing that this paper conveys is the relationship between the geopolitical relationship between the two countries affects the degree of similarity in the two. So this is represented on the figure as a solid line indicating no relationship between the two regions. A dotted line represents a sort of dependency, like in terms of trade between the two regions. And this dotted line represents regions that actually exist in the same country. And so if you look, for example, at the distance between the two regions being 5,000, you can see that the set of dotted lines, which indicate regions in the same country, have a remarkably higher degree of homogenization than the regions that have no administrative relationship to each other. What this basically demonstrates is a correlation between human trade and globalization in causing the spread of invasive species and increasing the overall degree of homogeneity in the world's flora. And the final thing that I wanted to convey about the paper is that this paper shows an increase in homogenization over most, if not all, of the world's regions. So in this figure, the average taxonomic homogenization between the regions is demonstrated on a scale between yellow, which indicates a lower degree of taxonomic homogenization, to a darker green color, which indicates a high level of similarity between the species, or a taxonomic similarity between the two species. And what this basically reflects is an observed relationship about islands. Islands in general have a high impact of invasive species. And if you look at islands in isolated regions such as Australia, for example, you can see that the study demonstrated that the high impact of invasive species in that region was correlated with a high degree of similarity of Australia to other regions of the world. And if you look, and although the study shows a more global understanding of how invasive species affect the uniqueness of the flora of certain regions, it does not do this for all of them. So previous studies had done this on a continental scale, but this one does on a more global scale. But some regions still lack enough data about invasive species and the levels of native and invasive species to be able to show a distinct correlation between the spread of invasive species and an increase in the homogenization between the world's regions. So what I want to leave you all with is that the spread of invasive species causes a greater degree of homogeneity in the world's flora, and this indicates a decrease in biodiversity. And biodiversity, as I said, for me in my personal story, it fundamentally affects, or personally affects, my psyche. But beyond that, it affects the economic livelihoods of many people, and this paper just shows, using data, why it is important to curb the spread of invasive species. And I hope that this presentation also brings to the forefront issues such as the spread of invasive species, literally in our own backyards in California. For example, there's a large spread of jubata grass and ice plant in this region of the world. So I hope that the next time you see these invasive species, you will consider how the introduction of these invasive species and the continued spread of it actually decreases the overall amount of biodiversity in the world as a whole. Thank you for watching my presentation, I suppose.